joining today's webinar. We're thrilled to have such a great turnout and looking forward to debunking the myths of hiring people with autism. Such a hot topic, and over COVID we've seen an increased appetite from many of our clients and hiring managers in this space. We have an incredible panel today to lead this conversation, but first I'd like to open our session with an acknowledgement to country. As we gather for this webinar, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and doing so recognise and acknowledge the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. I acknowledge the Kulin Nation's elders, past, present and emerging, and all the land that we work and live on. With gratitude and respect, I acknowledge all Aboriginal land and country. Thank you so much. Today's housekeeping, I know it's a bit of a boring topic, but in today's session, you've all come unmuted, but we want the session to be really interacting. So if we are debunking the myths, we need to hear from you. So please, I'll be manning the Q&A tool. If you have any questions or comments for our panel, use this function and we'll respond to you either live or after our session to make sure that we've been able to answer your questions. So today we all come together to highlight International Day of People with Disability. So we're here today to raise awareness for International Day of Persons with Disability, which happens on December 3rd every year. An international recognised day promoted by the United Nations since 1992. So a day that has been gathering momentum for the last 2 decades. This day seeks to increase awareness for people living with disabilities in every aspect of their life, raising awareness to ensure those with a disability are treated with respect, equality and opportunity. So the theme for this year is See the Ability in Disability, which I think coincides really nicely with neurodiversity. So let me introduce you to our guest panelist. So today we have Aaron Mercer. He is the CTO at Xceptional. Aaron is passionate about making big change for autistic and neurodiverse Australians, building inclusive hiring practices and technology which showcases natural ability and talents, creating opportunity and experience for the most underemployed cohort in Australia. Married with 2 boys, an advocate for social procurement, my go-to for all things technical, and a genuinely good bloke, I welcome Aaron to the panel. Joining Aaron today is Dr. Melanie Hayworth, the founder and CEO of Reframing Autism. RA is mostly run by autistic people. Their perspective on autism doesn't come from professional training or university study or by book learning. A unique perception that comes from lived experience. Reframing autism means acceptance, inclusion, equality and employment, ensuring autistic people are free to be their true selves. A mother, a homeschool teacher, a change maker and an inspiration. I welcome to our panel, Dr. Melanie Hayworth. Aaron, I'll refer back to you now to get the conversation started, and I really look forward to debunking the myths of people with autism in the workplace. Thank you.
I have in the Australian market. There's so much alignment between our mission to provide meaningful careers for autistic people and IPAs. Friends, I share today not as an expert on autism in any way, but as a neurodiverse individual myself. I have ADHD and my youngest brother is autistic. But as someone who for the last 3 years has grown an organisation that's purpose is providing meaningful careers for autistic people. We, Xceptional, have built assessment technology, processes, and a whole suite of services around providing meaningful careers for autistic people. And really our business is that theme around See the Ability in Disability. Our focus is really on what are the strengths and what are the business benefits of hiring autistic people. Often the focus is around how to accommodate, how to make workplaces accessible, which is incredibly important. Our focus has been what are the untapped strengths, and my message to the employers, both large and small, that I spend my day speaking with is this is simply the largest untapped pool of talent in Australia. and is particularly applicable to areas like finance, operations, and technology. Hopefully, can I click through, Kate? How can I click through? Here we go. Oh, hang on, click back. Apologies. I'm going to click back one. Here we go. So, what is? It's a very responsive keyboard. So, autism is a lifelong condition that, among other things, affects how people relate to their environment and other people. The reason I emphasize lifelong condition there is one of the services that we provide is coaching and job support for people that are lucky enough to have got a job, and Mel will share some of the employment stacks in a moment. But for those that are lucky enough to get work, we are often asked to come and coach. And there is a misperception out there. One of the first ones to debunk is autism cannot be cured. It doesn't need to be cured. Our focus is around setting people up for success and matching the best people into the best teams and the best environment. But our work is never focused on curing people. I've had conversations like, they don't seem to be getting any better. Just calling that out there. But it's about setting up organisations and the individual to thrive. It is a spectrum. It's a spectrum that affects more men than women, about 4 to 1. But it's often thought that women are underdiagnosed for reasons that we'll cover shortly. The spectrum can be best represented in the stories of 2 individuals that have come into our community. One's a young man who lives in Western Sydney called Aidan. Aidan is incredibly efficient with mathematics and technology. At a very young age, 6, he was rebooting Microsoft and installing Microsoft systems. At 13, he won a competition that NASA sent out to school children. And at 15, he designed a fully functioning weather station, which is still in operation. Aidan is selectively mute, for those that know that term, with people he doesn't know, which means he won't speak. So anyone on this call might struggle to get Aidan a job at the local pizza parlour. But Aidan has an amazing mind. We met Aidan through one of our custom assessment programs that we run, and he blew us away. And we've matched him with an employer who is looking for data analysts. This story, some of you might have seen, was covered by News Limited earlier in the year. And I guess the crux of the story is we had an employer who was willing to look differently at someone's skills and give them a job based on a work sample and the profile that we had done without ever speaking to the candidate. No phone screen, no face-to-face interview, no Zoom call. Just a Skype instant message chat and a work sample. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a lady called Bryony, who we are good friends with. Bryony is a qualified criminal lawyer who is now a data scientist and works within the public sector. Bryony makes her own dresses, and on the weekend she does musical theatre like Gilbert and Sullivan. Bryony and Aidan are both autistic and both represent the spectrum. Our approach is always to employ the technology ATP. Ask the person. Everyone is an individual, and if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person. And so our approach, as is IPA's, is always the right person for the right role, but understanding that autism is a spectrum. The social interaction, it can be particularly confusing and anxiety causing for autistic people. And what that can lead to, if you think of the job interview process, it is one big social interaction. How you present yourself on paper, how you cope with a phone interview that might be scheduled, or it might just be someone calling you, how you meet people in the lobby or over a Zoom call. And simply our conclusion when we started the business 4 years ago was that is the first thing that needs to change. So we have completely reinvented that, because to kind of be frank about it, that is the worst way to engage an autistic individual. You are assessing someone in their least preferred method. And it's no wonder that most autistic people fail at that process. We had a young man come to us in Sydney who, well, he'd never worked, but he was in his late 20s and he'd sent out over 700 CVs and had kept a detailed spreadsheet of all the rejections. Sensory sensitivities can also be a challenge for autistic individuals. Not every autistic individual has sensory processing disorder, but a good proportion do. And that can mean they've got acute sensitivities to sight, lights, smells, sounds. We know one individual that we placed into a major Australian bank who has told me before that he knows when there's times of high trade volumes because he can hear an increase in the humming of the mainframe. That is how sensitive his hearing is. Now, the workaround for that, for those employers on the phone, is really quite simple. That individual has noise cancelling headphones, which for those of us that have worked in a noisy open plan office, actually works for people that aren't autistic. And that's one of our key findings, is that adaptations that are often quite small that work for autistic people can work for everybody. Another sensory sensitivity which is common is smell. So Sarah, who works in our team, half of Xceptional business is neurodiverse, and most of our tech team are autistic. And Sarah has an aversion to the smell of coffee, which can be hard in a tech environment. But the workaround there is, once again, really simple. If Sarah's in the office, we put a lid on our coffee. We're not talking about changing bathrooms or putting in separate toilets or making wholesale changes. We're talking about things as boring as coffee lids and noise cancelling headphones. There's a unique skill set that's often associated with people, autistic people. Often they're fantastic visual thinkers. That can mean that they're great at things like pattern recognition and attention to detail. The flip side is also true, that often there's a deficit around verbal processing. So answering questions on the fly in an interview back to the social interaction is not necessarily the best way to engage. Often autistic people can need longer to process things they hear verbally, but can provide amazingly detailed responses if given the questions in a written form. Hopefully that clicks through. There we go. Oh, there we go. Now, the advantages of autistic employees. So, as I said at the start, our focus has been with Xceptional to focus on the unique untapped strengths of autistic people. We are not a charity. Organisations who work with us are not seeking us because giving an autistic person a meaningful job is a good thing to do. They are seeking us out because there is a business advantage. Among those business advantages are sustained concentration and ability for prolonged periods of deep work. The autistic employees that we have, that we've placed, the studies that we've read overseas, tell us that autistic individuals can pay as much attention at the end of an 8-hour or 10-hour day as they can at the start. Who else on this call besides Mel can say the same thing? I can't. That sustained concentration can mean that autistic people can find it quite difficult if they're interrupted. Our tech team runs an agile environment. For those businesses on the call that are familiar with agile, involves things like daily stand-ups. And one of our employees, Tim, who you might have seen on the ABC's TV show Employable Me, who got a job with Xceptional as a software tester, was asked if there's anything preventing Tim from doing his job. And Tim said, this meeting, which is probably what we were all thinking at the time. But the point goes that autistic people can have amazing periods of deep work, but businesses need to think through allowing them the space to do that, and setting up the environment to allow them to have those prolonged periods of hyper focus. Faster problem solving. So the Autism at Work program that JP Morgan Chase trialed in the East Coast of America 5 years ago found that autistic employees in a software testing team were 48% faster, and as much as 92% more productive than non-autistic employees. That program is now in 16 countries. Now, those of us who are all in business know that businesses don't roll out and scale programs that don't produce results. Closer to home, we've got a relationship with a company in South Korea that does labeling of photos for AI applications. They work with Kia and Samsung. And their autistic employees, they found, were 50% faster whilst being 50% more accurate. And they didn't intend to start a business to solve the unemployment problem. They intended to start a business to meet the needs of their customers. And organically, they've actually grown into an amazing employer of autistic people because they want the best. Often autistic people have superior memory and strong attention to detail. There's a saying at Xceptional, before we send anything to a client, have one of the Tims seen the work. We have two Tims, both of them are autistic and work in our software testing team, and both have what you would only describe as elite attention to detail. We published a guide a few years ago for employers, which is readily available on our website. And after the production company, the ad agency, our COO, our office manager, myself, all read the 8-page document, Tim found 7 mistakes after all those people, including the quotation marks, one of them being around the wrong way on one of the pages, just from one read through. So nothing short of just amazing. High integrity and low turnover. So the largest proportional intake or work program for autistic people is the Israeli Defense Force. They have a program that focuses on things like aerial surveillance and seeing where rockets are being built up on the West Bank. For those that know that area, it's a dynamic area, sometimes a dangerous area of the world. The Israeli Defense Force are not employing autistic people because it's charity or a nice thing to do. They're doing it because their lives depend upon it. Not all of us are in, none of us probably in an environment like that, but it's been amazing to see that program 10 years on has a high attention rate, much higher than they expected for the full 3 years of service. Closer to home, we know from the work with the New South Wales public sector that people with disability have half the turnover rate of people without disability who disclose. Half. There's a business case just in that, in terms of making your workplace more accessible and deliberately hiring people with disability. The challenges. The UN estimate up to 80% of the world's autistic adults are underemployed and unemployed. Well, why is that? Our research, the work that we've done so far, and our knowledge from overseas, really it lands in a few key areas. The traditional recruitment process that often relies upon people articulating their skill, selling themselves with a cover letter or a CV, navigating a 15-minute phone screen, and then having a face-to-face interview. In late 2017, Xceptional was asked to work with a global outsourcing company who was working with a major Australian bank. And one individual, an autistic individual, came to us as a possible candidate. This individual had was graduating with a master's degree from a university in Sydney. Just had an amazing brain and some really interesting interests. That individual had such low confidence because they'd been knocked back so many times trying to get grad roles, that they told us that they thought that it was as realistic for him to get a job than it was for him to go on SpaceX and go to Mars. He just thought it wasn't on the cards for him. He was never going to get a job despite his skills. He had topped almost half his subjects in his 4-year degree. On the phone screen for this major Australian bank, he was asked a question. He was asked, "Tell us, how would you compare yourself to the other candidates?" And his name's Anthony, and he doesn't mind us using this story. And he said, "I do not know. I have not met them." Those that have kind of heard the Exceptional story may have already heard that. What you may not know is that Anthony ended up getting a job after we advocated on his behalf and got a copy with his permission of his academic transcript and sent it to the one-up hiring manager. He's still working with that major Australian bank and has been promoted. But we need employers to actually relook, and we work with them to relook at the process, because we're not always available. And organisations like Mel's are not always available to advocate on behalf of people. And often we hear from employers who say to us that there's no doubt that they're hiring great people. What they worry about is who are they missing out on, because they're missing out on people like Anthony because of the way that the process has a heavy reliance on people's self-promotion and being able to articulate skills. Unwritten, for those that are lucky enough to get through that process or skilled enough to get through that process, unwritten social rules in an office can be kind of challenging. We think COVID has really leveled the playing field. 92% of our candidates prefer to work from home at least part of the time, but it is a misnomer and another misconception to debunk that autistic people are not social. What they don't appreciate is open-ended, unwritten social engagements. In 2018, as our team was growing and we'd won awards from Google and a few other organisations, we started an kind of autism in tech meetup in Sydney, which was initially just lunch that we put on. And no one came. For months, no one came, except their own staff, autistic staff, who probably didn't want to come, but we didn't force them, but we encouraged them. And then we asked our staff why no one is coming, even though a lot of people were reaching out to us and congratulating us and wanting to see how they could get involved. And one person said to us, they don't know what it's about. And what he was really saying is there were unwritten social rules and they needed an activity. So we then bought a game machine, a couple of game consoles, and within 3 months, we'd needed a bigger room because people brought their friends, and because there was some kind of structure around it and there were things that people understood the rules. For those of you who have job interviews that are face-to-face and kind of get to know you, often managers think they're being disarming when they have no kind of agenda and it's just a get to know you kind of session. The opposite is actually true. That is incredibly stress inducing because they do not know what is required of them. They simply do not know how to navigate that. The physical environment is less of an issue now with COVID, but as people return to the office, things like the sensitivities need to be looked at, and our team and IPA kind of help with that. But things like noise cancelling headphones can assist greatly. Masking to fit in. Masking, the way that I would describe masking, and Mel might be able to elaborate on this, is acting. Basically, people learning how to look by observation and using those great pattern recognition skills to understand how people in the social situation react. Bryony, who I mentioned earlier, told me that she learnt that when people told a story and then they shut up and then others around laughed, that was a joke. And so she taught herself to laugh. She didn't understand what the humour was or didn't find it funny, but she acted. You think of the exhaustion, the mental exhaustion of having to act to be something you're not through the day, which often means women in particular are better at that, which may be why they go undiagnosed, but it can also mean that prolonged periods of social interaction in the office can be exhausting for them. Mel's shaking her head in agreement with that. So we are very careful in our business, which is, has built an autism first culture since day one around that, or what we're asking of people in that social context. By far the biggest barrier though, conscious of our time, but by far the biggest barrier is the perceptions, the lack of understanding, the biases, and I'd say the fear on behalf of hiring managers and businesses. We get a really mixed reaction. We get everything from, oh, that's a great charity, or I could get Rain Man and some amazing skills. But there is always a sense that this needs to be a specialty project. Our real goal and desire is this just becomes a normal thing, and we're assessing people in a way that kind of suits them, and you're getting the best person for the job. But the biases, the perceptions, the fear are real. And as you leave today's webinar and go back, hopefully excited to your own organisations and talk about what might be able to be done, whether it's spoken or not, that is the reality of what you might face. And I think hopefully today we can go away and in the resources that we provide afterwards to show how mundane, how everyday reasonable adjustments are, and how simple techniques like asking the person can be to really tap into some amazing and talented group of people. That's a huge kind of focus of our work, and one of the reasons why when we started speaking to IPA, we're so delighted to hear that they run inclusion training, and that's a big part of setting people up for success. I'll finish there unless there's questions, and introduce have a conversation with Melanie. Kate, are there any questions that have come through that you want me to ask, or keep going through?
Yeah, go. I've got two questions, but if you bring in Mel, I think that would be great, and we can sort of wrap the questions up at the end.
Yeah, cool. I might blank this. Melanie, thank you so much for joining us. It's we had the pleasure with Xceptional of Mel joining us on a webinar earlier in the year, and we just had to get her back. Really appreciate your joining us. Melanie, you're the founder and CEO of Reframing Autism. You're a proud autism advocate and a proud autistic woman. And reframing means acceptance, inclusion, equality, and employment. What can you tell us about the employment stats around autistic individuals in Australia?
Thanks so much for having me today, and for letting me sort of talk from an autistic point of view and an autistic perspective. Look, the employment statistics for autistic adults are pretty dire in Australia. In the last couple of years, we have seen, and that's not taking into account COVID, and I imagine that we'll find some, impact of that as well. But in 2018, the labour force participation rate for autistics was around 38%. So that's quite low. But probably what's more striking is that when you compare that to the labour force participation rate for people with disabilities other than autism, which is 53.4%. So we're a good sort of 15% less employed than other people with other disabilities, and 84.1% of people with no disability that's the participation rate for people with no disability. So people with disability generally are at a grave disadvantage in terms of employment statistics, but autistic people are the worst served in the disability population in terms of our employment. Amaze, which is a fabulous Melbourne autism organisation, did a great report on autistic employment last year. And they also talked about the autistic unemployment rate being around 3 times that of other people with disabilities, and 6 times that of people with no disability. So what we know is that half of unemployed autistic Australians have never had a paid job. Half have been out of employment for over 3 years. So that's also quite striking. And of those who are employed, around half of those report underemployment in terms of the skills. So, you know, they might be working in their local Woolworths or, but they have a master's degree, which, you know, that kind of story that you've alluded to already. Or they are underemployed in terms of hours. So over 50% stated of autistic adults who have employment would like more hours and more work and can't get that. We also know that 20% of autistic people who have had a job in the past have lost their job specifically because of their autism, because they've either not been able to cope in the workplace because reasonable accommodations weren't made, or because employers were not willing to make reasonable accommodations. And we also know that we're underrepresented in tertiary, whether it's TAFE or diploma, Cert 3 degrees, and that's again compared to all other groups. There's a vast underrepresentation of autistic people in those tertiary education units. So unfortunately, if you're autistic, it's not a particularly hopeful story in terms of our employment prospects.
And also on a global scale, Melanie, Australia is one of the people with disability, recognising today, but compared to other OECD countries, we're the second or third worst country in terms of employment participation rates of people with disabilities.
Absolutely, yeah.
What do you put that down to? Like, it's not a simple kind of an area, but what do you think? What are the reasons that you see in your work for that being the case?
Look, I mean, I think the fear and the stigma and the stereotypes. I can't talk about the disability community in general. I have no expertise beyond the autistic community and other sort of what we call psychosocial disabilities. So, neurological invisible disabilities. But I think there is a great deal of fear and stigma attached to having disability. We still talk about disability as a dirty word, as something that you don't want to have. Australia is, we're still a very, what we call an ableist society. We still think that being able-bodied and having a typically developing brain is preferable to having a divergent brain or a divergent body. And I think that prejudice comes through in the opportunities. There's also something that's called the presumption of competence, which basically means that if you don't presume that somebody is competent, you don't give them the opportunities to show that they are competent, you don't expect anything from them. And so they never get the opportunity to achieve. They never get the opportunity to show you what they can do. And I think we are a very long way from presuming that the autistic community is competent. And so we're just not given the opportunities to show how very competent we can be.
Melanie, you've gone and studied a PhD and you've founded an organisation. Can you, before you did that, can you share with those on the call about your own experience in kind of trying to find a full-time role in your areas of interest?
Sure. So I'm a fairly driven person. I kind of fit a lot of the things that you were talking about, Aaron. So I'm currently doing a second PhD. I full-time homeschool my children. I run my charity, and I'm a mother and I run a household and all of those sorts of things. So I go a lot, and that has always been the case. And my passions run very deep. And in the past, I've sort of, if I've had a job, I've never had a full-time job. I've never been employed full-time, but I was working, I sort of fell after my PhD, as many PhD students do into sort of a temporary research role. And I was doing that particular role, and the job came up for a permanent position on that research team. So it was the role that I was doing, and I kind of felt that I could manage the role very well, and I was doing a very good job. But because of universities and bureaucracies and the usual and the equity of having a proper recruitment process, the job was advertised, and I had to apply for it and go through the recruitment as everybody else. My CV looked really impressive, and my written responses were fine, but I got into the interview and the intense pressure of having to perform and pull things together that I might know, but I couldn't access at that time. The adrenaline, the cortisol, the stress of it was just such. And you talked about selectively mute. I prefer situationally mute because it's not selective. We don't get to choose often. It just, and I couldn't articulate. I could have put anything together. I couldn't talk. I couldn't, my boss who was there was sort of trying to prompt me to think about experiences that I'd had and already worked my way through. But I wasn't able to articulate any of those things. And so I didn't get the job, and then found myself out of a job. And that has been sort of the pattern that I've had, that if I've had some ad hoc work that I've fallen into because of circumstances, when it's come to recruiting, in a way that's much more traditional for a permanent position or a full-time position, I've not been able to manage those kinds of just the requirements.
So, Melanie, there are people on the call who have probably passed on people as skilled as you because for various reasons. What could the university have done in that instance to give you a better chance of success? Because you're as you said, you're already doing the job. You're obviously highly capable and a great academic background. How could they have made that more accessible for you?
I mean, I think there's some really simple ways of doing a couple of things. Certainly providing the questions in advance. It's just a super easy thing so that I could prepare a script. So, I mean, one of the stereotypes around autistic people is that we do a lot of scripting. So we work through social scenarios in advance and try and think about different ways of, framing our answers so that they are the best answers we can provide. So giving us questions in advance allows us to script up and to think about, make the connections that we're, our orthogonal thinking, those putting together disparate ideas, and that's a hallmark of autism, but it's not also something that can be done on the fly. You need some time to process. So I think just providing the questions in advance would have been a massive bonus, because I had no idea what to expect either. What sorts of questions were the things that were important to me in my role seemed not to be important to the people who were employing me. And so the questions that I had expected to hear were not the questions I heard. And that also was a huge barrier. So not having the questions in advance. And something else you alluded to, just knowing communication preferences. So I can't do phones. I am, again, situationally mute on phones. I really, really don't like to talk on phones. I can if I'm absolutely forced, but it's just not my happy place. And I'm not going to be my articulate best on the phone. So simply knowing that there are different ways that you could, you can connect with people, and that they will have communication preferences where they'll be able to show you who they are at their best, not at their worst.
One of the things that we do that's really important is actually in a profile that we put together of an individual is actually spell out those communication preferences. Because if you think of a 15-minute phone screen or a face-to-face interview, when the person who is doing the interview or the phone screen is just doing their best and is probably following some sort of a script, but they don't know who's on the other end of the phone or sitting across them from the desk. And so kind of informing them using that ATP principle, ask the person, informing the people of how they need to be, kind of communicated, or how they can be best communicated with. And that goes to, what you and I were speaking about earlier in the week, Melanie, that, you make adjustments, or you make kind of adaptations, small adaptations for autistic people or people with other disabilities. It actually works for everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the key point. I mean, as you said, there isn't, I would argue that most people would do a much better interview if they had the questions in advance, if they could have time to understand the kinds of things that they're being asked, and have some time to process. And I think if we, as companies, as organisations, as businesses, want to find the best people, we want to take sort of a strengths-based recruitment approach, and really we want to see where people are at their best and what they can offer. And, tripping them up or catching them out, probably, particularly for an autistic person, is probably the way that you're going to see how they'll be at their worst, not how, they'll be in the everyday, in the office space, or, working for you. So.
Yeah, well said. Kate, I'm conscious of time, and I think there were some questions coming through for Mel and I. Is there anything that's come that you would like us to answer?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. We do. I've got another question here for both of you, actually. If we were to start hiring neurodiverse people or autistic people, how do we know that we've identified the right roles, and how do we feel confident in our own processes to ensure it's an inclusive one?
I can answer that really quickly. You probably don't until you kind of have a conversation, with us or with the team at IPA around role identification, manager identification. The right person for the right role is a key part of what we do. We will not place people in any old organisation in any old roles. It starts with a conversation about what you're trying to achieve, and I think if we approach it from a skills base, what are the kind of skills that we need? What are we finding it difficult to kind of find people? What areas match to the natural talents of autistic people? That's a really good starting point.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I think the big keys are, it's no different than any other person. You can never 100% guarantee that a person, regardless of disability or neurodivergence, is going to be 100% great fit for a role that you think that they're going to be a great fit for, or is going to be able to work for the manager that they work with. So in the same way that you would go through the processes for any other person in any other role, those are absolutely important. One thing that we do know about autistic people and working and successful work environments is that managerial supervision, mentoring role is really crucial. So making sure that relationship is really strong is going to be very it is fundamental to the success of the role.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you, Aaron. And I think what we're hearing, or what I'm really hearing really loudly, is that good recruitment practices, good role identification and hiring practices and inclusion and respect is the fundamental of hiring neurodiverse candidates, as well as just the general Australian public. It doesn't debunker or minimise the recruitment process, and it actually gives equity across all applying for Australians to show their very best selves through the process. So thank you so very much. I am mindful of the time. We did have some more questions, but we can wrap that up through direct email. Mel, always a pleasure to have you on board. And Aaron, your stories and experience within neurodiversity is something that I've relied on over the last 12 months. So I appreciate the coaching and the growth. For those that aren't aware, IPA and Xceptional do have a common goal. Our vision together is to positively impact lives with a partnership to create over 100 positions for autistic people over the next 2 years. We're hoping to deliver training, inclusion training to hiring managers for 5 of IPA's national clients on autism acceptance. And we would welcome anybody on the call today to reach out to Aaron or I if they have interest to building an inclusive and diverse workforce that we know will add value to all of your businesses. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for starting the conversation around why neurodiversity matters. And over the next couple of days, you'll receive an email and some communications from Aaron and I around this amazing topic. But until then, take care and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, bye.